But tonight we are here to not only talk with Christopher Swann about writing mystery and thrillers, crime novels, but also to celebrate his new release. And Chris is now the author of three novels, Shadow of the Lions and Never Turn Back being the ones before the new one coming out, A Fire in the Night. Chris is obviously a novelist, and he's also a high school English teacher with a PhD in creative writing, no less. And he has been a Townsend Book Prize finalist. He has twice been a finalist for Georgia Author of the Year. And he lives with his wife and two sons in Atlanta. And Chris, I'm always glad to see you, always glad to talk to you. So welcome to the program.
Thanks so much, Zach. Thanks for having me. And hey, everybody. Appreciate that
So,
intro, man. Glad you remember the PhD. That's real.
A PhD. I mean, I deal with a lot of people who have masters in creative writing, but you are it. You are the doctor writer that I know.
I'm a unicorn.
I actually think I may just call you that from now on, Doctor Writer. So, yeah, that sounds exciting, doesn't it?
Yeah. No, it was good. It was a thing. It was something that I really wanted to do, and I was lucky to go to Georgia State and had some great teachers and learned a lot from them. John Holman, for one. But yeah, it was great.
Well, first and foremost, congratulations on A Fire in the Night, September 7th. September 7th, and we get you first. We get to talk about it before anybody else.
Yes, you do. Just got the hardback in today, so yeah,
awesome.
That's gorgeous. So
did you knock on it? I feel like that's what you're supposed to do when you go. I did.
I was like, I like the dust, like knock on wood on any kind of material. Best kind of luck you can get, whatever.
Yeah. Knock on book.
Knock on book.
So cool. Well, let's talk about The Fire in the Night first, and then after that we're gonna get into mystery writing and a lot of the elements and such thereof. So I always do this with writers, and it's that dreaded question that makes people cringe. But I'll just phrase it as what is Fire in the Night about?
Sure. Fire in the Night is about Nick Anthony, who is a retired history professor who is mourning his late wife, who passed away from cancer in the past year, untimely death. And he is holed up in his cabin, which was supposed to be their retirement spot in Western North Carolina, and just sort of wants to be left alone and sort of going off the grid. And then his 16-year-old niece, Annalise, who he doesn't even know exists because he's estranged from his family, shows up, stumbles onto his porch with the story that her parents have been killed and the people who have done it are chasing her. And she's never met her uncle, but her father, one of the last things her father told her was, find your uncle, and here's where he is. So Nick is now saddled with a 16-year-old girl. And meantime, a third character in play, Cole, who's a military contractor, which is a sort of formal way of saying mercenary, has been hired by a mysterious client to retrieve some information at any cost, information that they're pretty sure that Annalise has. And so you have these three characters that are converging in the otherwise idyllic mountains of Western North Carolina, Cashers and Highlands. It goes from there. But one thing I will say is Cole and Annalise both think of Nick as this late middle-aged, retired history professor. And Cole thinks this isn't going to be too hard to handle. But Nick is more than that. And he's going to have to call on some skills he'd rather not have to call on, but he will.
While we're on there about characters, I'm curious in this particular instance, what sort of where did these characters come from for you? Were they like there before the story, or was the story and then you created the characters?
Usually, and I usually ask other authors too, like, where do stories come from for you? And Every story is different, but usually I come up with the characters, maybe a scene or a kind of a scenario. I came up with the idea of Nick. I've always been a sucker for stories where you think you know the protagonist, or you know the main character. Okay, he fits into this box, or she fits into this pigeonhole, and then turns out no, they're different. And that was Nick for me. And I wanted to have a strong female character because this was very much Nick, and then there's this man chasing him with a team of killers. But I like strong female characters. I have strong women in my life, my wife Kathy, my mother, and I always have fun playing with those sort of dynamics. And so I needed somebody, and I had the idea of Nick being a widower, so he has his memories of his dead wife. I said, that's not quite enough. I know, I need a kid, not a little kid, but a teenager. And I teach high school, so I tried to think about everything I know about, the teenagers I've taught for several years, and put them into Annalise. And she was a whole lot of fun to write. And trying to see these characters coming together, and not knowing each other, having to trust each other. That created a really good dynamic. And then for the third one, Cole is the villain of the piece, or a villain of the piece. The best advice I've heard about creating bad guys, and I think we've talked about it before. I know Brian Panowich and I talked with you a couple of years ago about heroes and villains. Yeah. Villains don't really think of themselves as villains, right? They're the protagonists in their own story. Yeah. And that's sort of Cole. He isn't under any kind of illusion that he is doing something noble. He's like, I got a job and I'm going to do it. So that's where the characters came. Those three characters came together, their relationships, and the story went from there. I could come up with a story without characters, just plug them in. But I've read stories like that, and they feel kind of like paint by numbers, man. They're not. There's only so many plots in the world. You gotta, if it's not a character you care about, then the story's not gonna be so good. But you give me a character that I'm gonna want to follow and see what they do and care about what happens to, then I'll follow them through any kind of story.
Yeah, I think being able to create a sense of empathy with the reader, between reader and character, is such a vital thing. And I agree with you entirely. If it's characters not worth reading or caring about, you're not going to care about the story either. So just a reminder to everybody who's here, as we're going along, if you have questions for Chris, there's a Q&A function at the bottom middle of your screen. Just click on it, throw your question in there, and we will address them as we go, or we'll get them at the end, whatever it happens to, however it happens to work out. But Absolutely. Get your questions in for us. So Fire in the Night, you use the Western North Carolina mountains as a setting, and in Never Turn Back, you were largely in Atlanta, and obviously you were regionally based. And do you want your stories to always be somewhere near you? And what, it's kind of a two-part question. What leads you to a specific area, and then why did you choose North Carolina this time?
Well, for one, I'm from North Carolina originally. My grandparents lived for over 50 years in Cashiers, North Carolina. There were a couple of Yankees that came down from Pennsylvania and New Jersey, respectively. My grandfather said he was fine. He realized after about 35 years, he'd finally been accepted into the sort of mountain society. And this is before there was anything in Cashiers. They opened up the very first gift shop up there. Now you go up and it's a sort of booming little village, but they moved in and there was a crossroads and one light, and that was it. And I would go visit as a kid and work in their shop. And I don't claim to know the mountain community well at all, but I got to meet some folks who, locals who did work in the shop. The girls, my grandfather would call them, although they were they were in their 30s or middle age, and I was this, gawky 13-year-old kid, and they tousle my hair and say, help me go get this thing out of the stock room, whatever. But growing up there and seeing the mountains and seeing how it developed, and living in Asheville for a few years, and my father's from there. That was an area that I was just drawn to. I like writing things set in Atlanta, but for this one, I wanted to have something set in a more remote area. And I know that area fairly well, and it's a good, mountain setting is always great. And you can also have, one thing I like about remote settings, and I've talked with other authors about this too, like we a lot of us don't like cell phones. Like, we love our own cell phones, but we hate them as fiction writers, because you read all these stories where people like, why didn't you just call 911 and you couldn't reach the phone. Well, now you carry it around with you. You just Google. I don't know what this is in Italian. I can't read. Google it. You're like,
yeah. Cell phones are terrible for tension.
They are. So, but if you're and there's only so much you can do with like being in a remote island or in the mountains, but you can do that a little bit. So I wanted to have that kind of setting. I just was sort of drawn to it, and it made sense for the kind of story I wanted to tell.
Right. Yeah. Well, this one is your third, as I mentioned, and the first book is always an entirely different experience up to the point of acceptance. It's an entirely different experience because you've had all this unending time to work on it. There's no deadline short of the ones you set for yourself. So when you had the first one and you started the editing process, and then you got the second one, you're the editing process, and then the whole process after, and now you're in the third one. When you look at the three of those, what is the difference for you in that process? Where have you evolved as a writer? Has the process evolved for you? Is it more complicated? Now I'm throwing just a bunch of stuff at you. So I think it's, I think it does sort of feel like it happens to you as opposed to you having control over, if that makes any sense. The first book for everybody is very different, and it's something, some people write their first book in a spurt of activity. Some people, it takes them a very long time to get it done. For me, I spent about 10 years working on a different book that's under my bed and is going to stay there. But it was actually my dissertation for Georgia State. So it's on a shelf in the English department library, and that is the only shelf that book is going to see. But I learned how to write and how not to write through that. And Shadow the Lions, my first book, was comparatively easier. But once that was done, I was telling you a little bit before we got started tonight, once that got done, I thought, okay, I had an idea for a second book, and it was like, I wrote the first book and I got some good press and people, bought it. I have an agent, right? I have signed books that people, copies of it, and I've gone to, I've done panels and things. And I got to go to the private authors party at the Decatur Book Festival, Zach. I mean, I'd arrived. So that's right.
And then I sat down. It's like part of something in my head was like, oh, that's sweet. Yeah, that was that book. This is this book. And book number 2 was a bear to write. It was just it was a mess. I had the story in mind, but I had past, I had present, and I had the pacing was off, trying to fit in the past material in the present. And it just, I was stuck. And luckily I found a really good editor who believed in it and saw the story I was trying to tell. It was really frustrating until that happened. And she said, why don't you do X, Y, and Z? And I thought, where have you been? Because you get and it seems easy, but it's, I mean, when you're writing, and this, when you're writing a book, you have readers, you have friends, you have support, you have other authors, but at the end of the day, it's you alone in front of your laptop or your legal pad or whatever you write on, and you have to make decisions and decide how you want the story to go. And I needed somebody with experience to look at it dispassionately, because I was too close to it, and say, you need to do this and that.
Right.
That second book was really hard. And everybody says the sophomore movie, the second album, novel number 2. Yeah, they're hard. I'm not complaining. I was able to publish books and all that, but it was a struggle. This one, I got the idea for the characters, and this one I kind of saw the major parts of the story all the way through, and I knew where I wanted it to end. There was a lot of room for improvisation and surprise on the way. I don't like to plot it out too much. I can talk about that later, but I got enough of it to where I thought, okay, I know how to do. I know where I want this one to go. And so, of the 3, A Fire in the Night was probably the easiest in terms of organization and kind of laying it out. So that one, that part's gotten a little bit easier. I've been very lucky to where I have not suffered from writer's block in the sense of I don't know what to write. I can always come up with a story. For me, it's more, yeah, I've got a great story, but I think first I need to rearrange the spice drawer. Yeah, I've been meaning to do, and that cabinet door is kind of wonky. Let me just go. And my wife's like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm fixing, go sit down and write.
I'm procrastinating. Leave me alone.
And I'm not sure why, because once you get, at least for me, once I get started, I'm like, okay, it's all right. And some days you don't get a lot of words, and some days you get a bunch. But who's it? Nora Roberts said, the one rule is ass in the chair.
Yeah.
It's not wait for the mood to strike. It's like sit down and just write. And some days it'll come and some days it won't. I think it's starting. It's scary. And I still am not sure why. Maybe fear of failure, or maybe the words will dry up, or I won't know what to say. They come.
Yeah, I think we talk about this every year at the conference, and I know some people just talk about it all the time, but the idea of imposter syndrome, that feeling that maybe you're not really that good at it, or you don't belong in it, or you're doing, I think it's that fear of failure, that doubt that comes in when you sit down. And I am envious of people who have the ability to look beyond that and just sit down and write, because no matter where I'm at in my evolution as a writer, I always have that moment when I sit down and I'm like, oh, please let this be good.
There's a great story by Neil Gaiman about imposter syndrome, about being at a party, and he's talking to this older gentleman who's been celebrated that evening at this party, and he says to them, what are you thinking about? What do you think about what you've accomplished in your career? Neil Gaiman says to this man, the man's like, honestly, I'm sitting here and I'm looking around the room and I'm feeling like I feel a bit like I'm out of place, like I shouldn't be here. I mean, there are great writers and there are great statesmen here, and there are all these fantastic people who've done wonderful things. It's a little intimidating. And Neil Gaiman says, okay, I get that, but Mr. Armstrong, you went to the moon. And he said, if Neil Armstrong can feel like a little bit of imposter syndrome, then okay, and I love that story in terms of, Neil Gaiman tells it better than I just did, but the sense of, and everybody at some point is like, is this really where I belong? I mean, I've been teaching this is my 26th year of teaching, where I teaching high school, and every year I'm nervous as hell walking in front of the students. They're all looking at me like, okay, teach me, entertain me, whatever. But that's okay. And then you push through that. And it's the same thing when you're writing. It's just, you got to get started and get through that fear of whatever it is, and just put words in the page. Right? I'm very much just throw it on the page and I can go shape it and fix it later. I don't mind that. Some people have to write like you're laying brick. They got to get this done, and then I can do the next level, and then I can do the next. Now I'm sloppy, but it works for me.
Well, let's launch into mystery and crime and
Sure.
all of that thriller stuff. But I want to start with this seems to be something that you derive enjoyment from, writing in this genre. So why do you write crime?
Crimes kind of universal. And if you have a crime, crime can mean anything, but a crime in general is a violation of order. It's a wrong that has been done. And when you get to a big violation, like say murder, like most civilized societies on earth will be like, okay, there are certain things that are just off the, like these are just beyond the pale. Like murder is one of them, kidnapping another. But whenever there's any kind of a crime, again, the order has been violated and you want somebody to restore that. And the bigger the crime, the bigger the stakes. And if you're writing a story about crime, the stakes are immediately raised for everybody involved. And you've got something that can draw you in. Okay, who did this and why? Or how do we stop it again? Or how do we stop, how do we bring justice to this person? I think, and crime is something that touches everybody, either directly or indirectly. When I was in college, I had a Suzuki Samurai soft top Jeep. And one morning I got in to go to class and started the car, and I put my hand down, reached down to turn the stereo on, and my hand went right through a hole in my dash. And I looked, it took me a while to process, but there was this big hole with wires coming out of it. And I looked around, the back of the soft top had been sliced open. Someone had gone in and stolen my car stereo. It was in a parking lot next to the house where I lived, and there were other cars around it. It wasn't like I was out in the middle of nowhere. Someone stole my stereo. I was livid. I mean, I drove to the police station and I filed a report. And I had two tracks in my head of how this was going to go. The more ridiculous one was that the police officer who dutifully and politely took my report was going to say, oh yeah, sounds like George. Like George is the town criminal. It's like, yeah, me and the boys will call on him. And they would like kick down the door of George's apartment and catch him red-handed with my stolen stereo. And I'd get that back, and George would go to jail. And maybe the mayor would thank me for stopping the crime spree that was George, what's his name? The other track in my head, the more realistic one, was like, you're never going to see your stereo again. But someone had gone into my car and stolen my stereo. And it was the height of privilege of me to be all like pissed off about this, because, I call my parents and they're like, you can fix okay, we'll get a new top for the car because that's kind of shot, or at least the back plastic part, and go price out a stereo, see if we can find one. And for me, that crime was an inconvenience. I was a little scattered for a couple of days when someone had broken into my car. But it was mostly like, I just can't listen to music on the way to school. And I was sort of, but the problem was solved because I could afford it. Crime can reveal a lot of things about the victims. Some people that would happen, they're like, well, now I don't have $150 to buy a new car stereo, let alone install it. We'll just go without music. Or maybe they've got to drive 6 hours a day to commute to their 2 jobs, and the radio is the only thing that gives them joy. Now that's taken out of their life. Crime kind of cuts across and through things like class and money and race, and it can highlight all those things. Crime novels don't have to be, socio-political novels, but they can be. You look at somebody like Sean Cosby, who's writing, Blacktop Wasteland and Razorblade Tears. He's a Black man in rural Virginia writing about crime. Rural noir, I think, is what they're calling it, and it's they're amazing books, and he's a great writer. And there's the good guys and the bad guys, and shades of gray, most of them, and at the same time, the stories are revealing things about race, poverty, rural America, especially rural Southern America. and not by accident. But
Yeah.
it's all wrapped up. So crime is a great vehicle for all of that. And you've got an automatic built-in sort of plot, like, okay, we got something we have to do and something's got to be solved. And there's probably going to be some danger. Depends again on the kind of crime. It could be a cozy crime. It could be a murder. It could be a police procedural. It could be a private detective. It can be an amateur detective. You can go all kinds of ways with crime, but that's just always drawn me. I've always liked stories where things happen.
Yeah. And one of the things about writing these stories is that you have all this information that is both legal or investigative, and you really have to make sure that you get those details correctly. That's not something, it's like baking in a way. You have to get it exact. You can't just wing it. So when you're doing this, how do you make sure you get those details correct?
The internet helps. I worry more. I actually have worried more about if I'm writing about in a place that I can't go to physically. I'm like, could you see this thing from there? Could you do, I'll use, say, Google Maps. But I don't write police procedurals because I don't know enough about that world. And it wouldn't feel authentic. I'd have to do a whole lot of research to make it seem authentic. I think that a lot of writers, the research we do, we have to do enough to where we can convince the reader that we know enough about, we can kind of fake that we know what we're talking about. And some writers, they do because they have a past that's from that. And maybe they were private investigators at one point. Maybe they were police officers at one point. I do enough to give some verisimilitude to the story, and to, this sounds like I'm saying I'm lying, and I'm not, but make it sound like I know exactly what I'm doing. You don't have to know everything. And Never Turn Back, there's a scene where a character has disposed of a dead body. It's not the main character. Somebody has taken a dead body in a car and taken care of it. And it says, but there's evidence, there'll be physical evidence and like DNA and stuff in the car. And the character took care of the body. He says, do you think I don't know how to clean a car? Now, I did start doing a little research into how would you do that? Mm-hmm. And like every other writer on the planet, I hope to God no one ever looks through my search engine history, because man, especially crime, what are you plotting? I'm like, nothing. I'm trying to figure out how somebody would do this and how you could stop it. But I realized at that point in the story, that's not important to the story right then. You don't need to, the character doesn't need to explain in detail exactly how you would clean the car and how you would use bleach or not use bleach or whatever. So sometimes those details you can let go, but you find as much as you need. And it's internet research, it's reading other books, it's talking to people. I had to talk to a coworker for my first book, and her husband was a defense attorney, and said, I need to talk to David. I wanted to ask him a few questions about my book. She says, yeah, what do you need to know about? I need to know what kind of bail you would get if you were, so old and it was the first drug charge or possession in Virginia. And she looked at me, I said, it's for a book, Nikki, it's not, I swear. And it was. And he told me, and I cross-referenced that, and then I used that. So research can be fun, but in the end, I'm avoiding stories where, again, the main character would be a police officer or a detective or something like that, because I don't yet know enough about that world. Mm-hmm. And those worlds have very specific procedures, and I'm afraid that if I tried to do that it would just come across like an episode of Law and Order, mm-hmm. which is great, but when you're reading fiction, you're like, I'm kind of looking for this to be a little bit more real, maybe. Yeah. So basically, I know, and I learn enough to be able to fool the reader into thinking, okay, I know far more than I do.
Okay, that works. Um, so with any writing, there's storytelling that is a obviously a huge, if not entirely, focal point there. And proper storytelling comes with elements, whether you're writing the more fiction or crime. When you're putting your stories together, what elements of storytelling are you focused on?
Um, Character first. I want to write as uh, cleanly and as well as I can. In terms of if you're having a plot with any kind of crime, you have to know, okay, what kind of crime has happened? What is this really a crime, or is this a crime according to, the protagonist or the victim? Like kids are like, "Mom, he's on my side of the seat." Like that's a violation. That's like,
Mhm.
that's not really a crime, but to the kid it is. Or is this something where, there have been laws broken? Um, you have to have a victim. Um, you have to have uh, you have to have some sort of agent who is going to redress this wrong, whether it's going to be an actual detective or police officer, or somebody who's got more personal stakes, or an amateur who's just drawn to it. Um, you need those. And if you're going to have any kind of if you have a crime or a mystery, um, you have to have some kind of resolution of it. I don't mean that it just stops, but I mean, I've read a couple of books by authors I really like, not many, thankfully, but I've read a few where the central mystery never got answered. And you can do that if you replace that with something that's even more compelling or more important. And in real life, not every mystery gets solved, not every crime gets punished. But when you're reading crime fiction or mysteries, you kind of, you're waiting for that to happen. I remember, I'm a Star Trek fan. I remember the third Star Trek movie with the original cast was The Search for Spock. And William Shatner once said, well, I mean, it's called Search for Spock. So at the end of that, if at the end of the movie, Captain Kirk turns to the screen and says, well, we didn't find him. I mean, everyone would start throwing rocks. So you're going to have to find Spock. But how and what's at stake and what else happens. I feel pretty strong if you're going to write a story about crime or mystery, you're going to either need to solve it, or you're going to have to, that's going to be less important than something else that takes its place.
Yep.
If you've got characters asking questions, this happens in every mystery. You start poking around, you're going to find something. You might not find what you wanted to, but you're going to find something. And there are going to be some people that don't like what you found. So,
Yeah. Just a reminder, everybody, if you have questions for Chris, go ahead and drop those in the Q&A and we'll get to them as quickly as we can. You mentioned the end, and I had several points that I wanted to talk about that have to do with ending, not the least of which is that, it's often been stated by mystery writers that for them in particular, that their way of crafting a plot was to start at the end and then plot backward to make sure that all the details lined up perfectly. Where do you fall on this?
I'm trying to think of a half-assed response that's funny. Somewhere in the messy middle. I think my first novel, is just in Shadow of the Lions, two boys who are roommates at a boarding school, and the protagonist Matthias gets into an argument with his friend Fritz. He has violated his friend's trust. He's betrayed him in a sense, and his friend Fritz is horrified and runs off from him into the woods, and he disappears. When I was writing this book, starting to write this book, my wife said, you ought to have something dramatic happen early on. Have somebody die, have them find a dead body in the first page. And I said, I said to her, no, he doesn't die, he vanishes. She said, what are you talking about? I said, I don't know. And I stopped folding. I think we were doing laundry or something exciting like that. And I put the shirt down I was folding. I went down the hall to my office and started writing the beginning where that happens, where this friend disappears. I didn't want him dead at the beginning because then it would be a murder. Okay, who killed him? Why was he killed? And that could be a good story, but it wasn't the story I wanted to tell. I thought if he goes missing, like he just disappears. And that's where I did research and found that something like 250,000 teenagers think they disappear every year. Now, the majority of them, or a majority of them, end up back home within a year. Maybe just run away, but a big chunk of them don't, and they're just gone. What had happened to his friend? Now, I wrote that. I had no idea what had happened to Fritz. None. I figured I'll just figure it out as I'm writing, kind of like you figure it out while you're reading a book. For me, it turned out that's a terrible way to write a mystery. But there's two things you want to avoid. I call it Butler and aliens. It's silly, but a mystery usually fails in one of these two ways. The first is, oh, the butler did it? How surprising. I figured that out on page 13. I read the next 350 pages, hoping in vain, it turns out, that something interesting would happen and I would be proven wrong or whatever. Instead, no, I was right the whole time. And there was no tension. And thanks for ruining a otherwise perfectly lovely weekend. That's one way they fail. The other way they fail is aliens took them. There was what? A random kind of Deus ex machina, yeah. He was abducted by a random, that makes, it's like cheating. There's no sense that that's where you're going to go. I try to avoid both of those. But I realized in my first book, okay, I've got to figure out about a third of the way through. I thought, all right, I got to figure out what happened to Fritz before I go any further. And I did. And I thought, okay, now I have to figure out, what is Matthias, my main character? What is he going to learn? Is he going to figure out everything or part of it or what? I answered that question. And those were my two kind of lighthouses. And I knew where I was going, but I had a lot of space between where I was and the end, where I could wander around and improvise and have other things happen while I was writing. With my other two books, I've tended to have an ending in mind, but I don't want, if you have a real complicated plot, I can see, okay, here's the end and how do you get here? I tend to think more of where do I want a character to end up and what would lead that character to get to that place. So slightly different. I'm afraid if I make a plot where I'm like, okay, here's the ending. Now I have to lay everything out in really deep, minute detail. I'm afraid that if I do that, then I'm going to create not a trail of breadcrumbs, but I'm going to basically be designing a super highway that's really obvious for a reader to go, oh, okay, I see what's going to happen. It makes sense. Like I don't, if I plan it out too much, I'm afraid that I'm going to give stuff away. That may just be part of me being lazy and avoiding coming up with a really detailed outline. But I've found that I like to give myself wiggle room so I can change things as I'm going, because I figure out, and usually it's in weird time, like I'll be taking a shower or something and I'm like, the brother did it. Why didn't I gotta get out of the shower and write it down before I forget.
Right.
I'll go change things, but I still know the ending would still work. But if I made it the brother, and I'm just making this up off the top of my head. So that's kind of where I am, I think. And some people have to have that outline, that sort of more rigid outline. I know some authors who they have to answer all of that and do all of that before they write. And that's their process. That just isn't mine, but it works for them and mine works for me so far.
Well, All right, so I mean, Agatha Christie has this quote that's to every problem there is a most simple solution, and it kind of speaks to what you're talking about here about working your way through it and trying to find these answers and everything. But you had mentioned breadcrumbs, and I'm sort of going to mix some things here. You want your reader to question things. Obviously, it's a mystery. You don't want them to figure it out too quickly. So when you're doing breadcrumbs and you're leaving these clues through, how do you ensure that you're not giving away too much?
Usually my wife will point things out that she's reading, because she reads about everything that I write, and she can be she's very honest, which I've come to appreciate more and more. I think initially I was like, okay, thanks, but could you be nicer? Because you're like, yeah, real men and women don't talk this way, or whatever. And we need that as writers. We need someone to read it and go, we need friends to be like, you're amazing, that's wonderful, I'm so proud of you, and I love this. Yeah, we need that, but we also need people to be like, this scene is just not working. That's part of it, is having another set of eyes on it. I think the one of the greatest compliments I ever got was from Jocelyn Jackson, who, it was about Never Turn Back. She read it and she said, you got me. I didn't see that coming, and you didn't cheat. I didn't see it coming.
What does that mean? You didn't.
I didn't. In other words, I didn't see it coming, but it made perfect sense. Like, oh, you mean that's who did the, oh my God, that fits. Oh, that's sort of what you want, where I'm trying to remember. I've seen, I'm trying to remember what it was. It was a not very good, it was The January Man. It was a Kevin Kline movie, and it wasn't all that great, but I think he was sort of a detective, and they were looking for this criminal, might have been a killer, and it turns out the killer was just a sort of random guy. And there were all these suspects and all. It was a nobody. And it was, which is supposed to be kind of the big, so it wasn't any of these people, it was just somebody. And I was like, I've been yanked around by the writers of this, and I don't feel gratified. I feel like you just sort of cheated. Whereas a really good mystery, or any kind of thriller, anything with twists in it, you're taken on this roller coaster ride, and you get to the end and you figure out what happened. And you realize, yeah, okay, technically I was manipulated by the writer, but I went along with it, and it was a whole hell of a lot of fun. That was a great experience, and you got me, but you also provided all the evidence all along that fits. There aren't any discrepancies. It's believable. And you had, you introduced the character back here. And now with hindsight, it's 2020, and I can see how that happened.
Yeah.
That's hard. I think one thing that I tend to do, one of my drawbacks is I tend to, and this goes to your Agatha Christie quote that you pulled out, I'll tend to make things more complicated than they need to be in earlier drafts. Like, I can't, this is too obvious. And that's where something like, again, Kathy will read something. I'm like, I got to get these two characters to like talk. But they're like separated. And I don't want to have a phone conversation. I'm because he's avoiding the phone she's like, and then message each other on Facebook. And I'm like, stomped out of the room. Like, that was so simple. Why don't you have them, how do I get, I had somebody breaking into someone's house and sneaking around. She's like, I'm hearing Mission Impossible music. Why? How do you just go? I'm like, oh, I've got to get him in the house. He's got to meet this guy. It's like spooky, it's scary. Like, I'm just go up and knock on the door. I can't do that. Try it. I did. And that was exactly what needed to happen.
Yeah.
So finding, sometimes simple is best.
Hmm.
That's hard when you're writing mysteries, because like if it's too simple, then everybody figures it out.
Right.
Finding that sweet spot where you've thrown enough red herrings at the reader, but they're interesting and they're engaging and they're not just annoying, and they fit in the plot somehow, and they tell you something about the character.
Hmm.
Those work.
Yeah.
So.
And there's this, I feel like I've been saying this a lot lately in talks I've done, but the idea of Chekhov's gun, which I know Stephen King cites in On Writing, about the shotgun on the mantle in the first act has to be used to kill somebody in the third act.
Yeah.
And with writing mystery, you honestly, you have so many of these little elements that are strewn throughout, the breadcrumbs and everything to that effect. But the biggest one is the killer
Yep.
that is hidden amongst them. And I'm obviously not asking you to give up what you tend to do, but what as far as when they show up, but do they need to be seen several times? Is it one long scene? Do we just see them in passing? What is cheating and what is real?
I think I think really good mysteries, all you are given all the clues, not all at once, but you, the reader, have access to all the information you need. My grandfather gave me a book of the complete Sherlock Holmes when I was like 12, and I inhaled that thing and I loved it. And what I liked about it was, Watson is not stupid. He's normally played as sort of bumbling in the TV shows and movies, but he's a smart man. He's an army surgeon. He's brave. He's strong. He's smart. He's just not anywhere near as smart as Sherlock Holmes, which makes me feel better. So, oh, if he can't figure it out, then I don't feel so dumb. But all the evidence is usually there and is presented, and Holmes then explains how it all fits. Now, I think a lot of stories like that, a lot of mysteries where who did it, if the evidence should be there, but it's not obvious, okay, how does it fit? And somebody in the story is going to make it fit. I think what works really well is if you see something, you're like, that's going to be important. And then it becomes important halfway through the story. And you're like, oh, okay, that's how it's going to be used. What? And then it comes back again and becomes important again in a different way. Right. Where you're like, okay, that's you're fooling. Like, okay, I thought you were done with that, but no, it's, or you think it's going to be this person. Oh no, it's going to be this person. Could be that. No, it was this person. You were right, but then you were led away, and you go back. You just. I'm teaching my students about sentimentality right now, about like unearned emotion, like just obvious manipulation, like in commercials. I'm showing them like the old Hallmark commercials where, oh, they're sweet, and the sensitive part of me is like, oh, and then the intellectual part of me is like, oh my God, they're totally manipulating us to like, this is cheesy. That's the kind of thing you want to, try to avoid when you're writing mysteries, is that sort of obvious manipulation, if that makes sense. And it's hard to do, but again, everything for me, everything goes back to the characters, and reminding myself, what does the character want? What's in the way? How's it going to end up? And every time I go down a rabbit hole, or I get lost, or I feel like I'm getting too complicated, or that it's not working somehow, I always go back to that. And at least 90% of the time, that solves it.
Yeah. So. Well, we've got a few minutes left, so if you have any questions, please get them in. I do have one I can read here right now. This one is from Daniel. It says, right about the midpoint, I like the reader to be on the protagonist's shoulder, and we're all racing toward the finish line. Do you think this is a good time to start tying off the loose ends?
It can be. It depends on the story. I think, and I think that if you tie up every loose end really neatly with a bow, that can if it's too neat or too pat, sometimes that can kind of ruin the illusion of the story. In terms of that kind of we're reading we know this is fiction, but we're reading it as if we care about these characters as if they are real. If everything gets solved too neatly, then sometimes I can like, okay, that's now I'm seeing the puppet strings a little bit, if that makes sense. But I do think, but if you leave a lot of loose ends, then that's just sloppy, and then the reader's like, well, wait a minute, what? Like you just hurried up to finish, and now I'm not going to be bothered with the rest of it. I think that you can start tying up loose ends halfway through, and I like the idea of you're as the story progresses, it might start off slowly, but it's going to be like a river that's where the channel is narrowing. The water's going to start rushing faster and faster. You're going to start, accelerating towards the end, and yeah, usually with the protagonist, and the stakes are higher, and the tension is mounting. We all like that, whether that's halfway through or it's in the third act or wherever. I think that is a good place where you start, you are aiming towards, okay, there's going to be a final resolution and you want to get there. And sometimes you can tie up loose ends afterwards, but I want to try to tie everything up at the very end.
Yeah. And speaking of, that's interestingly enough, I have one more question and then we're going to be out of time, and it is about endings. It's going to, I have this great quote from Mickey Spillane. I had to look it up because I didn't know the whole quote, but I remembered some of it. Nobody reads a mystery to get to the middle. They read it to get to the end. If it's a letdown, they won't buy anymore. The first page sells that book. The last page sells your next book. And I've always loved those last two lines there. For you, what is more difficult, or what do you put the most time into, the beginning or the ending?
The ending. I wrestle with endings. I think that's I have friends who write short stories, and short stories are a beautiful art form, and I love reading them. I struggle writing them because I don't know, like, how do you end the story perfectly in 10 pages? I can stop writing, but that's why I like novels. I don't have to end them for like 400 pages or so, right?
Right.
But so I think I really like beginnings. I'll spend a lot of time crafting it, but I'm excited about beginnings. The endings are what I worry the most about, because I have the same thing. I want you to get to the end and go, man, that, when you read a really good book and you close it and maybe you're like, I wish it went on longer, or you're like, that was perfect, or okay, that was you. It's hopefully it's not like, thank God that's over, right? You don't want your book to be like a marathon or like a bad dinner date. You want it, you want it to be this wonderful thing where people get to the end and go, okay, that satisfied me, that made me happy, or whatever emotion you're going for. So yeah, and the endings are what I work on the most.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, thank you. For everybody who's interested, Fire in the Night does come out September 7th. It's sold wherever books are sold, but we do always recommend that you go to your local independent bookstore to help support them. Yes. In Atlanta, we have a couple of we have plenty, but a couple of them that we want to focus on here: Acapella Books and Foxtail Bookshop. If you want more information about Chris, you can go to ChristopherSwann.com. And what I know things are wonky with pandemics and virus and the Delta variant, but what do you have any events coming up?
I do have events coming up. I am going to do, some of them are going to be virtual. Some of them are going to be in person. I will be I'll have a launch party here in Atlanta. I will be going to, at this point right now, I'm going to Quail Ridge Books in Raleigh. I'll be going up to the Hudson Library in Highlands, North Carolina, which is where a pivotal scene takes place in A Fire in the Night. I will be going to Charleston to do Movable Feast with Litchfield Books. Got a few things in the works. It's tricky with pandemic and making sure things are safe. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to getting out in the world and with this book and sharing it with everybody. And I will say, you know, Zach and I are both writers. Of course, we would love for you to buy our books. And if you don't, please get something at your local independent bookstore. These places are pillars of our neighborhoods and of our communities. And they, like many small businesses, have suffered this past year and a half. And they're doing everything they can to get programming to you and get books to you. Please do something to support your local indies, because they sure have supported us for many, many years.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, Chris. Really enjoyed having you here, and best of luck with Fire in the Night. I look forward to reading it myself.
Thank you, sir.
Hoping that, you know, maybe I can get to your launch event. We'll
Yeah,
see.
man. Fingers crossed. I hope so too.
Yes. Yeah. But thank you again. And yes, absolutely. Yes, everybody, please wear your mask.
Yes.
Thank you all for coming out. And this video will be edited and put on our YouTube channel. It's just Broadleaf Writers Association on YouTube, where we have just about 30 right now programs archived right now. And you know, go check it out. There's lots to choose from there. But thank you very much, and you'll have a good night.
Thanks, Zach. Night, y'all.